Hello, everybody, and welcome to my talk here, coming to you semi-live from the New Orleans airport at a coffee shop. I apologize I couldn't be there with you live. I found out just yesterday that I would be in the air at the time of my talk, so you get disembodied voice for Braddock. I'm going to talk today about some ongoing research that I'm doing now in relation to subtext and the ways that subtext can motivate different kinds of violent outcomes, particularly with respect to the far right. Now, I only have 15 minutes, so I don't want to waste any time here. But with the first part of this talk, I often play a game when I'm live with my audience, whereby you have to guess whether or not a series of quotes come from either a terrorist, somebody who's been convicted of terrorist offenses, or whether it's an elected official in the United States. So these quotes. Number one, this individual took out a full-page ad in a newspaper saying essentially that the 2020 quote, take matters into their own hands. Another individual released a manifesto demanding that all abortions, same-sex marriage, idolatry, whatever that means, occultism, communism, and all these things must be outlawed, and biblical law must be obeyed. If individuals yield, they pay their share of worker taxes. If they don't, all males in the communities must be killed. This was released in a manifesto that reached tens of thousands of people. The third quote comes from an individual who was claiming that they love Europe, and that is why they oppose the diversity in Europe. This individual thought that Europe was being subjected to an invasion of Muslims coming from the Middle East, and it very much mimics the white genocide conspiracy theory in the United States. Again, this individual released a manifesto saying so. And finally, this individual posted a meme to Twitter, essentially threatening a second civil war, whereby the red states, the right-leaning states, have the weapons necessary to engage in the war, while the other side doesn't know which bathrooms to use. Now, if I were here with you live, I would ask you to vote on whether or not you think these quotes come from terrorists or from elected politicians in the United States. But since we don't have time, let's go through here and see. The only one that is a convicted terrorist is the third, which was Anders Breivik. That came from the manifesto that he released in relation to his attack in Norway. The others come from elected officials in the United States. At the top, that is Tom Zalistowski, a former state representative, I believe, in Ohio. The second, that is Matt Shea, a former state senator in, I believe, Washington, who was found to be coordinating with militias in the Pacific Northwest. And at the bottom is Steve King, another American politician who often used dehumanizing language in relation to immigrants coming in from Mexico and often threatening civil war on social media. Now, the idea of this game isn't to trick anybody or anything like that, but it's to show that there is overlap in these kinds of communication these individuals use, which is a problem. If we have to think even for a second whether or not a quote related to violence comes from one of our elected officials or a far-right convicted terrorist, that is a problem. So I've begun to study a process, called stochastic terrorism in the literature. Now, it is an annoyingly academic term, but it's born from statistics. A stochastic process is one that is impossible to predict when and where something will occur, but it will reliably occur. So in the background, you might see the lightning strike. That lightning strike is indicative of a stochastic process. If you're sitting on your front porch and you see lightning will strike somewhere, it's impossible to predict when and where. Now, this relates to the low base rate of terrorism as well, because as we all know, a significant number of individuals will adopt beliefs and attitudes that we might call radical, but very few end up engaging in actual violence. However, when individuals use a mass mediated channel, or a public platform, where they use language that might be coded or might otherwise allude to the use of violence, when they reach millions and millions of people, even if somebody has individually a 0.00001% chance of engaging in violence, when you multiply that with millions of people, you approach the near certainty that at least one person will interpret it as a call to violence. Now, because the individual uses coded language and never overtly orders violence, they maintain plausible deniability despite the fact that violence occurs as a result. of the language they use. Now, a couple of things to know about this is that this is a political communication strategy, particularly in the United States and in other areas in Europe where populism has kind of had a growth. It's essentially advanced in popularity since the 2016 ascension of Donald Trump, and it's kind of stuck around since then. It's also important to note that it is not legal incitement to violence. As we saw with the Trump, the Trump impeachment trial, it was very, very hard to convict Donald Trump of incitement because the threshold for incitement is quite high, and what I described does not meet that legal threshold. And it's also important to note that it is employed by all kinds of political groups, though the far right employs it way more than even the far left in the United States. So the focus on the far right, excuse me, and I often have to justify this via emails that I get from some of my fans, as you see that quote. But the reason stochastic terrorism is laid out very nicely in a CSIS report showing that far-right extremism and terrorism, starting in 2008, has essentially dominated political violence in the United States. So because organizations and governments have a limited number of resources they can use to challenge and fight political violence, it's important to get the most bang for the buck. So the far right is where I pay attention. So to illustrate stochastic terrorism in kind of in action, I use the January 6th insurrection attack as an example to show how certain kinds of coded language can manifest in actual dangerous violence, resulting in harm, death, and what many people think is a treasonous act against the government. So to frame how this works, I use a theory of communication and psychology called reasoned action theory. Reasoned action theory is not a pure communication theory. It's essentially a theory designed to explain behavior by identifying what predicts behavior and then identifying what predicts those predictors. It's born from a number of other theories that are also kind of decision-making theories that have annoyingly similar titles. But ultimately, the theory shows that behavior results from systematic relationships between different predictors, and that you can ultimately predict behaviors and habits if you can understand the predictors and how they're interrelated. So at the bottom is a very simplified schematic of what reasoned action theory argues. And on the next slide, I'm going to show you the overall theory. It intimidates my students. Please don't let it intimidate you. But this is essentially what reasoned action theory argues. That any behavior, anything from brushing your teeth to deciding to do a presentation in an airport to political violence, is predicted by intention. Intention to do something, obvious as it sounds, has been shown to be the biggest predictor of behavior. Now, intention is predicted by one's attitude towards behavior, which is dictated by how much that individual believes that a behavior will help them achieve the goal they want to achieve, and also how much they think they might enjoy the behavior. Intention is predicted by perceptions of norms, both in terms of whether they see people they value engaging in the behavior, or if they believe that somebody they value would approve of them engaging in behavior, and their perceptions of control, whether or not they have the ability to and freedom to engage in the behavior. Those three predictors are what are predecessors to intention. Now, if we move back to the left, we see that there are several background factors that might predict beliefs that turn to these outcomes. Demographics, socioeconomic status, previous attitudes, culture, and so on. The area I'm interested in are the messages that people are exposed to that give them the beliefs that lead to these outcomes, which ultimately lead to behavior. So what I'm interested in this project is the kind of subtext that was used by President Trump and others that led to these kinds of outcomes. So understanding the kind of quotes that President Trump made and some of his allies made in the lead up to the January 6th insurrection, the first relationship to consider is the attitude-intention relationship. What we see in several of these quotes, some of which were from social media in the weeks leading up to the attack, and others actually occurred on the ellipse that day, you see the use of language that advocates for or mentions or alludes to the idea that fighting, however that might be defined, is a viable way of achieving what their goal is with that actual that rally that day, which was to quote, "Stop the steal." The use of belligerent language like fight, that instills the idea that fighting would be a useful and viable way to achieve what they want to achieve, thereby increasing intention to, quote, fight however they interpret it. And it leads to what we saw on January 6th that day. If we consider the norms to intention relationship, again, Donald Trump and others used very, very specific language that would have cultivated specific perceptions of norms that indicate that fighting, as we identified in the last step, is a normative way to engage in, quote, political discourse. What we see here is the strategic use of language like we, us, our, using this collective language. The individuals on Capitol Hill that day, in hearing these sort of language from someone they value, President Trump, and others that day as well, people that also gave speeches that day, it cultivates the idea that this is a normative way to engage in certain kinds of behavior. And as we saw, that also led to the intention, ultimately the behavior that we saw on Capitol Hill that day. Third, there is this perception of behavioral control intention. And here, there was language used that often indicated that people had the freedom and autonomy to engage in the behavior that we saw that day. Often talking about going up to Pennsylvania Avenue. President Trump even said that he would go with them up Pennsylvania Avenue, essentially arguing that they have the ability to overturn the election and that by doing what they did that day, that they would achieve their ultimate goal. Now, what are the different ways that we can message against these sorts of things? When there's coded language used, it's not as obvious how you argue back against it, especially because, as I mentioned, it is not legal incitement. So it's critical to maintain these First Amendment rights for all Americans, excuse me, simply because it's not illegal, people are free to do it. It's protected by the First Amendment, and that is sacrosanct. Second, stochastic terrorism is typically propaganda at a huge scale, reaching millions and millions of people. And third, as I mentioned, it will never make an overt directive to engage in violence. They maintain plausible deniability. So, some solutions that I argued. If you know my work, you know that I'm an advocate of attitudinal inoculation. But something I haven't mentioned in my inoculation work that is very important is that it's possible. Research has shown that you can inoculate not just against specific content, you can inoculate against strategy. So by telling people that this is a strategy that individuals engage in to manipulate their behavior, it might be possible to show people from succumbing to a level this of reasoned action theory and the literature. However, I'm in the middle right now of collecting actual data to demonstrate the ways that dog whistles can affect people's intentions and their behaviors. What you see in the background there is a screenshot from a survey that I'm distributing to people to let me know who the allies are, or who they perceive as political allies, or who they value their politics. I will then expose people to messages that have been implicated in the incitement of violence, albeit indirectly, and see whether or not it changes their beliefs, attitudes, and intentions with respect to engagement in violence. So, for example, you see Donald Trump there kind of in the middle. I will be showing people clips and with respect to storming Capitol Hill before and after. Another example, I don't think you can see him here. Acts. The use of violence as a means of preventing what they think is the replacement forthcoming. Now, again, I apologize for not being there and that I am a fan of their work, and I really wish I could be there in person. I still need to Australia. But if you have any questions, I apologize for not being able to answer them directly, but you are more than welcome to get in contact with me in any of the ways you see here. I would love any feedback, recommendations, virtual thrown tomatoes, anything you see fit to get in contact with me about. So again, and to present in this way, as I really enjoy talking about this kind of research, and I'm excited to see it move forward. Thank you all very much. Please enjoy the rest of the conference. And I'm sorry, again, I'm sorry I couldn't be there. Take care.
Okay, sorry about the audio disruption there, but I suppose we have quite a bit of extra time now after Jack's presentation for a few more questions for him. So next we're going to hear from Jack Klein, who's presenting work on behalf of himself and Professor Brock Bastian, the fusion secure base hypothesis. Can identity fusion reduce intergroup violence?
Hi everyone. My name's Jack, and I'm a social psychology PhD candidate at the University of Melbourne. Today I'll be talking about the fusion secure base hypothesis, which is some research I've been conducting as part of my PhD. And what this is really concerned with is a construct that's becoming increasingly prominent in social psychology, which is identity fusion. And identity fusion is an extreme form of alignment with a group, which has in turn been shown to predict all sorts of extremist behavior. Now, I think I can probably best explain exactly what identity fusion is with a bit of a story. So during World War II, 4 members of the B-17 bomber crew formed a pact that they would never abandon one another, no matter how dire the situation. Not long afterwards, their plane was shelled and went into a terminal dive. The pilot ordered everyone to parachute to safety. As the crewmen donned their parachutes, they discovered that one member of the pact, the ball turret gunner, was trapped and there was no time to release him. Realizing this, the other 3 pact members aborted their plans to parachute to safety, remaining on the plane to await their fiery death. And that's really what fusion is all about. It's about extreme devotion to a group, extreme levels of care towards the other members of the group, and most importantly, a willingness to sacrifice the self in order to achieve whatever the aims of the group are. So here's a concise definition. Identity fusion is a form of alignment with groups in which members experience a visceral sense of oneness with the group. You feel at one with the group. And traditionally, you can see in that diagram there, that's how fusion has been measured. There's 2 circles, one indicating the self and one indicating the group. And when one said that the circle indicating the group is totally encapsulated by the group circle, they were said to be fused. These days, we tend to use a verbal scale, which has better psychometric properties, but that really does illustrate the concept. Briefly, there are 4 key principles to identity fusion that I'll run through quickly. The agentic personal self principle talks about the degree to which fused actors, they tether their personal agency to the agency of the group. They are motivated to actually seek out and pursue strategies on behalf of themselves and the group with a level of agency. They're not mindless drones. The identity synergy principle, so that speaks to what I've already been talking about, this merging of the personal and social self, a feeling of oneness with the group. The relational ties principle, and that's really quite key. Rather than looking at other members as interchangeable members of the group, fused people tend to actually value one another as individuals. And the irrevocability principle. And this just speaks to the idea that fusion is sticky. When someone becomes fused to a group, they tend to remain fused. So just a brief tangent on exactly how fusion comes about. This is sort of an emerging area of research, but there seem to be 2 major pathways. One is shared biology. So people tend to report high levels of fusion, for instance, to biological family members, but also shared dysphoric experiences. So by that, I mean going through hardship with other people. These photos are of me, actually. I'm in the middle of both of them, going through my army training to become an officer in the Australian Army. And really going through all this through the mud, the rain, and all that sort of thing. It's quite a dysphoric experience. And when you come out the other end of it, you really do feel a sense of oneness with the guys you undertake that training with, and then that can extend towards the army as a whole, as a larger group. Okay, so why is fusion relevant to extremism? Well, it's relevant to extremism because the theory was essentially devised to explain extremism. So it was made or devised in the wake of the 2004 Madrid train bombings by Angel Gomez and Bill Swan. And in a lot of research, it's been shown to be highly correlated with willingness to fight and die for the group, so to engage in self-sacrificial behaviors such as suicide bombings and that sort of thing. And it's been linked to a willingness to commit violence in a whole range of contexts. So from intertribal violence in Cameroon, and I even read an article with a historian talking about how maybe Vikings were fused. So does this mean that one of the pathways to reducing extremism is to enact defusion, to reduce the fusion of people? Well, I'm not so sure that that's true. So one thing to say up front is that the relationship between fusion and violent behaviors seems to be moderated or contingent on perceptions of outgroup threat. And this is inherent in some models using identity fusion, such as the devoted actor model by the anthropologist Scott Atran. So for instance, he did a study where he found that fusion with Spain predicted a willingness to enact violence on Muslims, but only if these participants were reminded of the 2004 bombing. So it does seem like outgroup threat plays a role here. But what's really been under-researched or unknown to date is how fusion impacts on intergroup relationships and extremism in the absence of threat. What happens in more benign everyday situations when an individual is fused? And in fact, when you look at other psychological research, there's quite a good reason to think that fusion probably has quite pro-social outcomes when you really think about what fusion is. So there's the concept of a secure base, which is fundamental to attachment theory in developmental psychology, and often is spoken about in the context of a mother and her child. The child relies upon the mother as a secure base, will go to the mother when they need safety, security, encouragement, that sort of thing. In the same way, a group can perform this same function. A group can perform a secure base function in which the group can encourage its members and imbue them with agency to achieve their goals. It can also achieve a safe haven function, which it literally protects its members and keeps them safe. And there's a lot of research in developmental psychology looking at the effect of a secure base on behavior. And they've found that it's overwhelmingly positive. People who have a secure base, they tend to have better interpersonal relationships. So they're more willing to trust others, to interact with others. These are good things. It's also been found to have similar effects on an intergroup level. So people who have a secure base, they tend to have more positive perceptions of outgroup members. They're also more willing to engage in social exploration. So they're more willing to interact with members of other outgroups in a pro-social way. And what I argue is that really a fused group, a group that someone is fused to, should represent the ultimate secure base. And I'll just go through the principles quickly again to illustrate this. So there's a relational ties principle. As I mentioned, in a fused group, the members care about one another and value one another, support one another, encourage one another. This seems to be fundamental to a secure base. There's the irrevocability principle. When someone's fused to a group, they perceive the group as reliable. It's not going anywhere. There's the agentic personal self principle. So like I said previously, fused actors, they're not automatrons. They actually tend to have a sense of agency and also a sense of agency over the group. They perceive some level of control over the group, which really indicates that there's some level of reliability to be found there. It is a secure base. And then finally, the identity synergy principle. Because there's this merging of the personal and social selves where there's not really a distinction between the self and the group, recent research has found that just as fused actors are willing to fight and die for the group, they also tend to have an expectation that the group will fight for them. And so this refers to this idea that the group is a reservoir of social support and protection. And there's a bit of empirical research already to suggest that this interpretation is correct. So for instance, thinking about the safe haven function, the idea that the group will look after you and protect you, fused actors tend to report levels of invulnerability where they feel like they can't be hurt. Also formidability. So this image on the right is from a study done by Scott Atran, where basically fused actors tend to indicate that their group resembles more the buff Spanish person on the left, as opposed to the skinny ISIS guy on the right. And so fusion does tend to predict these feelings of formidability. Also, the secure base function, the idea that the group can support and encourage you. Fusion has been linked to increased personal agency, self-efficacy, and goal adherence, which really does seem to reflect this idea. All right, so then this leads me to the model that I've proposed in a recent article, which is that identity fusion predicts a willingness to interact with people from other groups and strangers via the safe haven and secure base functions. Now, this can result in an increased level of intergroup cooperation. However, crucially, it's contingent on outgroup threat. If outgroup threat is not there, if it's absent, then fusion, this sort of extremist, this extreme devotion to a group, very likely predicts a willingness to interact with outgroup members. However, if threat is present, then what my model predicts is that fusion will predict the violent outcomes for which it is most known. All right, so I've done quite a bit of research to speak to this idea. So I've done 6 or so studies just using general population people in the UK and the United States. And I've asked them to report fusion in a range of contexts, to their country, to their most important group, to their football team in the EPL. And what I've found is that fusion across the board tends to predict willingness to trust, so general trust, and interact with others. And so this does seem to indicate that fusion, extreme devotion to a group, can have these pro-social outcomes. So this includes a willingness to trust outgroup members, and it's not accounted for by personality covariates. I've also found in some longitudinal research that changes in fusion over time tend to predict changes in general trust. Then you can see on the right, I've conducted an internal meta-analysis over my full sample over many studies of about 1,500 people, and the relationship between fusion and general trust and social exploration tends to be moderate and significant. Focusing more on the moderation aspect of my model, the outgroup threat model is what I've been doing lately. And so I've conducted some research in Bangsamoro, which is an area of the Philippines, in the south of the Philippines, which is predominantly Muslim, and it has been the site of recent terrorism and intergroup clashes. So it was the site of the siege of Marawi, in which the Filipino government clashed with ISIS, essentially. And so because this is an area in which intergroup threat really means something, I felt like it was a good place to test my theory in the wild. And so in collaboration with the GCRF, which is an anti-extremist group, I was able to conduct this research. There's my research team on the right, waiting to get my survey done. So thank you. So I looked at a whole bunch of different group dyads, so essentially groups at different levels of abstraction that tend to conflict with one another. So I looked at Muslims and Christians, Moros, Christian settlers and Lumads. These are different ethnic groups that are in this region, and also 2 different rival political groups. And what I asked them was essentially how they thought about the other group. To what degree did they perceive the other group as a threat? And also, to what degree are you willing to trust the other group? And when we look at the results, it's quite interesting. I was pretty pleased with this. So you can see the blue line refers to people who indicated they were fused with their group. In this case, they were fused with other Christians of Bangsamoro or other Muslims. And then the red line is people who were not fused. And what you can see is that fused people, when outgroup threat is high, so in the bottom right of the graph, they were much less likely to trust the outgroup compared to people who were not fused. However, when outgroup threat was low, they were more likely to trust the outgroup compared to people who were not fused. So this does seem to say that fusion is not necessarily an instigator of violence or negative intergroup relationships across the board. Really, it depends on the threat moderator. And we found this with Christians and Muslims. We also found this across all the various ethnic groups that we looked at, so the Moros, Christian settlers, and Lumads. And also didn't quite get the crossover, but close enough. We also had a very similar pattern for the two political groups that we looked at. So like I said, this really does seem to indicate that fusion can be a force for good. It just depends on the context. So what are the implications? So one possible implication is that diffusion might not always be a good thing, because what you're really doing is probably undermining that person's secure base. So you're reducing their social resources upon which they rely, which might increase distrust and isolation and inhibit reintegration into broader society. But of course, it all depends on the context, right? It may be that diffusion is the only way forward. It really depends. But one question that you might ask yourself is, can alternative support networks be cultivated? So some people have referred to this as switching worlds. Can the extremist group be swapped for some other group that person might become fused to and rely on for social resources? So colleagues of mine at Oxford University have been doing this quite interesting twinning project in which they've paired up prisoners with different football clubs, and they're trying to switch this reliance on gangs and such to reliance on a football club. This is a switching worlds idea. There are also other things that that my colleagues have started to consider, and really we're interested in whether different strategies can be implemented to weaken the link between fusion and intergroup violence. So perhaps one solution would be to make peaceful alternatives to violence more salient. So make these clear, make it clear how you can peacefully achieve your goals and the group's goals. Promoting pro-social in-group norms and seeing whether there's some evidence that may have a role. And of course, reducing perceptions of out-group threat. The degree to which we can reduce out-group threat will presumably perhaps allow us to harness fusion as a power for pro-sociality as opposed to extremism. All right, thank you.
Okay, thanks. That was really fascinating. So do we have any questions for Jack? I've got a couple in mind, but give everyone else a chance. Yes.
Should I just talk? Yeah, sorry. Hayley's got the mic. Thanks. Hi, thanks for that. I think there's a lot of connections with theories around social cohesion and the way that social cohesion can be both a force for kind of positive pro-social connection, as well as in contexts of out-group threat, a negative phenomenon. So I was quite interested in those connections. But I was just thinking about the current context where you have a lot of people involved or attracted to violent extremism that aren't associated with a specific group. So I was wondering what your thoughts are about, how we think through the value of this kind of analysis in a context where, or whether you think part of the reason why so many people, say in kind of Western democracies, are becoming involved or attracted to right-wing forms of extremism, very broadly articulated, is because they aren't associated with either, with a pro-social group of any type.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the first thing I'd say is that I would never claim that fusion is, the only cause of violent extremism. And obviously, you can be a terrorist and not a part of a group. You can engage in extremist behaviour and not be a part of a group. It's just one part of the story. I know that Bill Swan, who essentially invented identity fusion, he's been looking at fusion not to groups, but to ideologies and to causes. That's sort of just recent research. So maybe that speaks to what you're talking about to some degree. I'm slightly skeptical that fusion to an idea would play out the same way as fusion to a group, but nonetheless, that is what he's looking at. Yeah, so I suppose, yeah, the only answer I can give is that, yeah, fusion is just a part of the story, and obviously violent extremism is motivated by a range of beliefs and thoughts, but insofar as it is motivated by extreme allegiance to a group, the behaviour that is manifested really depends on these contextual factors such as threat.
Okay, over here. Yep.
Yeah, I had a question. I might have missed it in the beginning. Did you, with your study, were you looking online or offline? And if it was online, do you how do you do that? Are you looking in private groups, and how do you analyze, the degree of fusion? Are you looking at the comments and the interactions and yeah?
Me personally, so I've predominantly used the verbal fusion of scale, which has really quite excellent psychometric properties in a range of contexts. People who score highly on this scale of fusion, which has items like I am one with the group, my group is one with me, etc. That tends to be highly predictive of self-reported willingness to fight and die for a group. But also in other studies, it's been found to show it to actually be predictive of real behaviour. So for instance, a colleague of mine, Harvey Whitehouse, went to Libya and found that people who are highly fused were more likely to be fighting on the front lines against Gaddafi. But anyway, those are the scales I've been using. For many of the studies, I did it online, so using sites like Prolific to collect participants online, so like panels. And so I'd ask them to, complete a series of scales and look at the relationships between them. But however, that the research I described at the end, the Filipino research, that was done in person, so people actually interviewing them. But again, it's survey research and looking at the relationships between different scales.
So it's not looking at them in their natural ecosystem online. It's taking them out to.
It's a survey.
It's a survey, yeah.
It's a survey. That's right. Yeah.
Thanks very much. A really interesting talk. Look, what I'm interested in hearing you comment a little bit more about is the question of the duration or the extent of identity fusion in terms of time. So identity fusion is not always static, right? And it's not always long lasting. So practitioners here, unaware of my wildly labor left history, close your ears now. I experience a lot of identity fusion on a picket line, right? One particular incident that I can think of. So I would have said I was completely fused with the great mass of, demonstrators, in those events. But it's not a static fusion. It's what you might almost call a more sort of spontaneous, even opportunistic fusion, and then it dissipates. Yeah, and then you might fuse. So where are you at in terms of both the static versus the dynamic nature of identity fusion, and the possibility of multiple fusion events or multiple fusion experiences, which I think comes back to a little bit of what Vanessa over on your left was actually getting to before in her question. Thanks.
Right. No, thank you. I agree with what you've said. So it's kind of interesting because traditionally when people first began to speak about fusion, there was this, or there is still this irrevocability principle, which is this idea that fusion is sort of static, that once you're fused, you remain fused. However, I sympathize with you. I think you're correct. I think that fusion can ebb and flow. And I found it myself. So, you know, those guys that I went through my training with at the time, I felt very close with them. Now I don't, to the same degree at least. And even I didn't speak about this in any detail, but one of my studies looked at this idea to a degree. So I'm not sure to what degree you guys are into EPL football, but essentially there was this event in the EPL where a bunch of teams said that they were going to leave the EPL and join the ESL, which is the European Super League. And a lot of football fans were very upset about this and protested it and went to the streets and whatever. And essentially the decision was overturned. And what I found was that after this event, fusion levels increased by quite a lot, because there was this sort of like important event of this win, this event of solidarity, and fusion did increase after that. And then other people have done research which have shown that when in times of betrayal, fusion can decrease. So in Spain, during the times of there were all these protests over Catalonia, I believe. Basically, after those events occurred, Spanish people tended to report lower levels of fusion. So I do think it can ebb and flow. And even some people have spoken about this idea of state fusion, which is maybe what you were talking about, where you're fused, but just for like a very discrete, temporarily defined moment. Really, all I can say is that research is still young on this particular area, and I think that the original irrevocability principle really overstated things, and actually fusion is more fluid than people think. I think the only reason that that principle existed in the first place, not to get too sort of into the weeds of social psychology with you, but fusion is often contrasted with this thing called identification, which is a more sort of wishy-washy kind of group alignment. And so relative to that, it's stickier. But yeah, I do agree that it can ebb and flow.
Okay, question up the back. Yeah.
Given that one of the ways that fusion is formed through shared dysphoric experiences, I feel like that kind of suggests that negative narratives where you're kind of creating this in-group and perceiving the out-group as a threat are going to be more dysphoric. Basically, you're creating a problem, come into our group to solve it. So how would you kind of create pro-social narratives to create pro-social in-group norms to try and counterbalance that?
Yeah, so I'd say, yeah, I agree that that's one pathway to fusion. And I mean, that's probably why it's so prevalent in soldiers. You hear about this band of brothers sort of thing, you know, fighting the enemy, it bonds you together. I guess all I'd say is that while that's one way to fusion, it's not the only way, and it's probably not even the most common way. People have found that fusion has increases after, for example, a natural disaster. And that doesn't necessarily have any sort of negative implications about an outgroup. And yeah, I think, like I said at the end, I think that obviously some groups have these sorts of negative messages about outgroups, and that's really where a lot of the problems occur. And rather than instituting defusion, perhaps trying to change some of these in-group norms could be more useful. How you do that, I don't know. I'll get back to you.
Got time maybe for one more. Yeah, Michelle.
I don't want to take anything away from anybody else who hasn't had a chance to speak yet. But since nobody else is waving their hand, look, I'm going to take advantage of the fact that Kurt is not here to answer any questions, just to make a tiny comment, an intervention. I thought what he was saying, and this is for our government colleagues in particular, of some policy influence. I thought what he was saying around inoculation in relation to strategy and not just content in messaging is actually quite an important point. What it reminded, so what does that involve? It involves a certain kind of semantic literacy. Yeah. We talk a lot these days in CVE circles around the importance of media literacy, what we do online, and so forth. The kind of literacy that you need around strategy is associated, with older fields around understanding rhetoric, understanding the way that language works, and so forth. So the very things that we need in that regard are emerging as key needs, if you follow Kurt's line of thinking, at precisely the time when funding for the humanities and social sciences, in undergraduate and graduate contexts has really declined. And it's a reminder to me when we're thinking about interventions from a policy perspective, that some of the things that we need to do the work that we're doing and to be effective in it actually come from very distal points, well outside the field. But it's a reminder of how important some of those basic things that used to be valued in the humanities and properly resourced and funded, are now jeopardized, and what other kinds of jeopardy that might bring in its wake. So I just thought I'd get that in.
Thanks, Michelle. I completely agree. And thanks so much, Jack, and thanks everyone for your questions. As Kurt said at the end of his recording, he's available for questions if you want to send him an email. So I think we can break for lunch. Yeah, great.